All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Bennett Brooks. I am a senior mediator with the Consensus Building Institute. We're a nonprofit that facilitates a range of collaborative dialogues, and we do lots in the area of wind energy. And it's my pleasure to be here today. And I'm joined by Maggie Ostus, who you probably met at registration, and by Rebecca Gilbert over at the table in the corner. And Rebecca will be taking notes throughout the day, and as is our custom, we'll be producing a summary that BOEM will, for BOEM, so they get the results of this conversation in a format that they can use. I just want to, before we dive into a really busy day, just say a few words of welcome, lay out sort of an overview of what today is about. And I think it's safe to say that just looking around the room and seeing the turnout, that's a pretty clear indication of the importance that you all put on this most recent conversation. I think I've been doing this work now for probably 5-7 years, and every meeting the room gets fuller. There's more interest here, and that makes for a richer conversation, makes probably for a more challenging conversation, but it's exactly the conversation that needs to occur. That's the point of these task force meetings, is to make sure that BOEM has a chance to hear all the different feedback that is out there, all the different perspectives that are out there. And obviously, as BOEM is doing its job, it's having lots of focused conversations around issues of transportation and fisheries and environmental considerations. And those conversations are really important because you can't beat sort of sitting around a table with a map and drilling into the details. But these conversations serve a different purpose. It's really important for everyone to hear the range of perspectives that are out there, because that's kind of the challenge that BOEM has, is to sort of hear all those perspectives that are out there and try to figure its way forward to its mandate, which is to promote offshore wind energy development and do it in a way that minimizes user conflicts. No easy task, but these meetings are really helpful to sort of surface those considerations and concerns and give us all a chance to understand what that looks like. So the primary purpose of our meeting today is for BOEM to have a chance to introduce its draft wind energy areas, and then really hear from the different perspectives that are out there, your reactions to these wind energy areas. You've hopefully had a chance to take a look at their documents. They've identified sort of primary areas, secondary areas, and getting your sense of if that first pass looks about right, or how they might want to rethink some of those issues or understand issues that maybe weren't clear to them yet. That is really the main point of the day, and we will spend probably 80% of our day on those kinds of issues, both through presentations and in small group conversations. As well, we'll have a chance to hear from a number of the developers who are pushing forward with their work and get caught up on sort of the status of those projects. And then, of course, we'll get to hear from BOEM on where this all heads next. That's always of interest, and it's really important for you all to be up to speed on that. A few quick notes just at the outset here. BOEM has invited a handful of sort of folks from the states to Coast Guard, DOD, et cetera, to share their perspectives on the draft wind energy areas. And so a bulk of the day will focus on that, and it'll give us a really a good look at some of those, how those groups look at these issues. We've set aside time in the afternoon, as I mentioned, for small group conversations. So you all have a chance to talk as task force members and really sort of, again, help animate for BOEM your thoughts around these draft wind energy areas. We've also have 2 different times for public input, one before lunch and then one at the end of the day. And then last thing I just want to note is this is, as always, a forward-looking conversation. So while BOEM will spend a little time up front, and we'll hear from Luke and from Jim Bennett around why the draft wind energy areas look the way they do. The purpose is not to spend time understanding that. It's really getting your feedback on the draft wind energy areas that they're putting forward. So let me just briefly, I think for sake of time, I'm not going to have everybody introduce themselves, but just for the benefit of the audience and knowing who's here, task force are a mix of folks. So we have federal participants. We've obviously got BOEM folks here, Coast Guard, Interior, Department of Defense, National Marine Fisheries Service. We've got states, New York, New Jersey, I believe Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Nyserda, New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, and then local governments as well. Audience, we have obviously a mix of folks here. So I just want to thank you all for being here. Our role as the facilitators of this conversation are to just make sure that everyone has a chance to weigh in, that we have a good conversation, a productive conversation, and really have a conversation that BOEM can then use as it rolls forward with its wind energy area. So with that, I want to create a chance for some welcome remarks from BOEM, from Nyserda, from New York State, and from New Jersey. And first up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Walter Crookshank. Dr. Crookshank is the current acting director for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and has worked in the Department of the Interior for more than 30 years. He earned a BA in Geological Sciences from Cornell University and a doctorate in Mineral Economics from the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Crookshank.
Thank you, Bennett, and good morning, everybody. As Bennett said, I'm Walter Crookshank, acting director for BOEM and deputy director in my day job. And at BOEM, we oversee the development of offshore energy and mineral resources in an environmentally and economically responsible manner. I want to thank all of you for being here today to talk about the future of offshore wind in the New York Bight. I particularly want to thank the members of the New York and New Jersey Renewable Energy Task Forces for spending their time with us today, as well as representatives that we invited. I'm not sure if they all made it, but from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. State and local leadership is essential to making offshore wind a reality in the United States, and I would really like to thank the states that are here, as well as those that aren't, for the leadership and commitment and vision they've shown in moving the offshore wind industry forward. I'd also like to thank the members of the public that are here and representatives from a variety of stakeholder groups representing wind developers, the fishing community, maritime interests, environmental organizations, and other key constituencies. Your knowledge and your expertise are very important and valued to us as we try and move forward in this process. We all know the ocean is a vibrant and bustling place, teeming with marine life and many different types of uses out there in the ocean. And we at BOEM must consider how any development of the outer continental shelf may affect both ocean users and the marine environment. And that is why input from all of you, task force members, stakeholders, the public, is very important as we try and put together a plan for the New York Bight. And it's also why the Renewable Energy Task Forces meeting like this today are so important to us. We're working hard to try and balance the needs of all of our stakeholders, and we try to take into account their concerns as we move forward. As an example, offshore Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we conducted a great number of meetings and forums with fishermen, fisheries managers, fisheries scientists to try and gather input. And while it's clear that not everybody is happy with where that ended up, we did remove a number of areas, 3 separate areas from leasing consideration due to the knowledge we learned through those engagements on the presence of high-value fishing areas and sensitive seabed habitat. In addition, at BOEM, we invest around $30 million a year in scientific research to help us understand the potential effects of leasing and development on the marine environment and on other uses of the ocean. And we try to identify ways to protect those resources and uses. So we hope this meeting today will provide all of you a similar opportunity to provide your thoughts on the draft wind energy areas you'll be hearing about shortly and that we'll be discussing throughout the course of the day. We encourage everyone to stand up and share their perspectives about what might be suitable for offshore wind and what areas might have potential conflicts that are particularly of concern in trying to coexist with offshore wind. I can assure you that we will listen to everything you have to say, and all of your concerns will be considered as we move forward with our process towards any future decisions. I also promise that we'll continue to engage with all of you throughout the process, from the area identification stage that we're in now, through leasing, to any construction operations plan that may come forward in the future. Offshore wind is a critical part of our nation's future energy portfolio, and we are committed to continuing to engage with all of you as we move forward along this path. That's why I'm here today, to hear from our partners in the task forces, to hear from stakeholders, and to hear from the public about what you feel we should be thinking about and considering as we look at the future of offshore wind in the New York Bight. So I look forward to listening and learning from all of you. And again, thank you for for your time and participation today.
At this point, I'd like to invite Alicia Barton, who is President and CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to come up and give a welcome. And just to say a drop about her, Alicia has held public and private sector leadership roles advancing clean energy projects and companies for more than a decade. Immediately prior to her appointment, Ms. Barton served as co-chair of the energy and clean tech practice at Foley Hoag, a global law firm based in Boston. All yours.
Thank you, Bennett. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Walter, for those great introductory remarks and for your continued partnership with New York State and support of this process to evaluate new lease areas in the New York Bight. Thank you to so many stakeholders for making the time and effort to be here today. It's critically important to the long-term success of offshore wind in New York State to have all of your engagement, so I'm really delighted to see such a robust turnout. I'm pleased to be here today representing the great state of New York alongside colleagues from the Department of State, the Department of Public Service, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and standing in for colleagues across 10 different agencies in New York State, all of whom are working collaboratively together to advance New York's vision for offshore wind energy. These are exciting times for offshore wind in New York State and for the entire industry in the United States. Earlier this month, Nyserda released its first solicitation for 800 megawatts or more of new offshore wind energy, paving the way for the development of a new clean energy resource to help meet New York's incredibly ambitious climate and clean energy goals. This solicitation represents a major step towards achieving Governor Cuomo's target of 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030 and support Governor Cuomo's mandate of obtaining 50% of the state's electricity supply from renewable energy sources by the year 2030, which is a critical foundation for building a clean energy future for all New Yorkers. The Nyserda solicitation also builds upon the recent news of the expansion of the first offshore wind project to serve New York State, the South Fork project, which was recently increased to 130 megawatts. And both of those announcements follow on years of work that New York State has undertaken to plan holistically for the emergence of offshore wind energy. This past January, almost a year ago, after more than 2 years of in-depth studies, analysis, and stakeholder outreach, Nyserda released the New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan. The master plan represents an unprecedented undertaking comprising 20 studies and extensive stakeholder engagement that helps shape New York's offshore wind goals and priorities and underscores our commitment to the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind energy in the Atlantic Ocean. The master plan also included New York State's request that BOEM expeditiously identify and lease multiple areas for offshore wind development in the New York Bight, with an objective to identify the areas that, on balance, pose the least conflict with existing infrastructure, shipping, fishing interests, tourism, and wildlife. With the benefit of years and study and research, we are confident that New York's extensive multi-year efforts have provided BOEM with an exceptionally strong foundation upon which to build the discussions that we're having today. New York recognizes and appreciates BOEM's efforts to respond to New York's request with its recent release of the draft wind energy areas within the New York Bight that will be discussed at the meeting today. We also support BOEM's decision to release areas in draft form for consideration by states and other stakeholders and BOEM's evident effort to balance multiple considerations in arriving at the draft wind energy areas. New York strongly agrees that receiving input and data from all stakeholders is critical to achieving successful projects in the long run, which is why we have been placing such a high priority on study, analysis, and stakeholder engagement for many years now. It's also why the current Nyserda offshore wind solicitation goes farther than any other state's contracting process has gone to date in requiring developers to explicitly submit plans that will address the important considerations of potential natural resource and commercial and recreational fishing impacts. Again, that type of holistic approach has been fundamental to New York's efforts in this area from the beginning. My colleagues Dorian Harris and Greg Lampman will provide a presentation later this afternoon that will provide New York's detailed feedback on the draft wind energy areas. But in general, we believe that the draft areas identified by BOEM appropriately take into account much of the important stakeholder feedback that has been submitted to date, and that those areas could be refined further based upon comments we plan to submit today to comprise a wind energy area sufficient to meet New York's request for multiple new lease areas without expanding the draft wind energy areas BOEM has recently identified. However, we also believe it is critical that BOEM move expeditiously to identify new lease areas and that these areas not be reduced materially beyond the already substantial reduction of the New York Bight that these draft areas propose. The reason is clear. New York and New Jersey collectively represent the largest energy market on the East Coast, and we have a combined commitment to install almost 6,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which far outpaces the anticipated offshore wind energy demand of any other region in the country. However, the current supply of offshore wind lease areas is simply not sufficient to bring forth the key ingredients we need in order to make offshore wind energy a true success. These ingredients include increased competition, increased local supply chain proximity, and lower energy costs as the industry reaches scale and accelerated pace. In fact, as of today, our region is substantially underserved relative to our market commitments. The existing lease areas in our region are capable of siting less than half the capacity as compared to the leases off New England's coast, despite the fact that our states are home to roughly double the population of the 5 coastal New England states. To be clear, we fully support and are excited about the recent offshore wind developments in contracting, permitting, and anticipated new leasing in New England. These developments are proving the thesis that offshore wind has in fact arrived as a real market opportunity for the U.S. We are cheering those advancements as much as many of you in the room. And moreover, we will be looking to developers in that region to compete in our current solicitation and to potentially serve the New York market. However, over the long term, it's absolutely critical that the lease areas available to New York and New Jersey region reach a level that will support our long-term regional demand for offshore wind energy, driven by the substantial size of our regional energy markets. Issuing new leases in the New York Bight in a timely manner and at a scale to drive industry investments commensurate with collective state commitments will not only benefit New York, but the entire Northeast region as we collectively seek to scale a new homegrown U.S. offshore wind industry that will bring infrastructure and supply chain investments and new American energy jobs. We are mindful of the substantial work ahead to realize that type of future vision, but New York looks forward to working with BOEM, with our sister states, and with all interested stakeholders to reach our collective offshore wind goals in a responsible, expeditious, and cost-effective manner. The necessity of moving forward with a sense of urgency could not be more clear in light of the increasingly dire warnings on the state of climate science, and we ask BOEM to follow not only the analysis New York has performed specific to offshore wind planning in the New York Bight, but also the recommendations of the federal government's own experts in the 4th National Climate Assessment to take action to advance offshore wind energy as soon as possible. Thank you, and I will now welcome my colleague, Jared Snyder, Deputy Commissioner for Air Resources, Climate Change, and Energy at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, to provide additional New York State perspective.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Thanks for that great summary of New York's leadership on developing offshore wind energy. And thanks to your team at Nyserda for a great productive partnership with DEC and other state agencies and other stakeholders on this and other clean energy efforts. I'd like to thank BOEM for organizing this important meeting and providing a voice to the people and businesses who have a stake in offshore wind energy development in the New York Bight. And thank you to all the stakeholders for participating today. New York's ocean resource is a critical resource for 13 million people, nearly 60% of the state's population who live along the coast. It's the source of livelihood of thousands of New Yorkers and home to an astonishing variety of marine and avian life. More than 300 species of marine fish use the area for reproduction and growth. Marine mammals and sea turtles traverse over long distances as they move among feeding, breeding, and nursery areas. Some white whale species, like blue, fin, humpback, and the critically endangered right whale, are increasingly being observed in the Bight. Deep-sea corals in the deep, cold waters of the Hudson Shelf Valley and Canyon Complex provide habitat for numerous fish and invertebrate species and contribute to marine biodiversity. Located along the Atlantic Flyway, the Bight also hosts a great diversity of migratory and resident birds, seabirds, and bats. It is critical that we nourish this valuable resource for current and future generations. And so today, and any day that we consider offshore energy development, we seek to protect that resource from two threats. The first is the existential threat posed by climate change and ocean acidification. Even the National Climate Assessment released this past Friday, lending a new meaning to the term Black Friday, documents the dire threat posed by increasing carbon emissions to the Northeast marine resources, echoing New York's own conclusion in last year's Ocean Action Plan. Ocean ecosystems are rapidly being altered by warmer water temperatures, ocean acidification, and sea level rise. The solution is clear. We need to rapidly replace the burning of fossil fuels with renewable energy, in accordance with Governor Cuomo's aggressive renewable energy goals. And doing so requires that we take advantage of the tremendous offshore wind energy resource. Now, my second point is that when we develop that resource, we need to do so in a way that preserves existing ecosystems, including those threatened by a changing climate, and allows other uses of the ocean resource to continue. And I'm convinced that we can do so. Focusing development on the Hudson's south and north areas is one way to achieve that goal, as we'll discuss today. But there may be other ways of meeting our multiple environmental and clean energy objectives. As we make collective and responsible decisions about offshore wind energy development in the New York Bight, we must consider the needs of all users of the resource and the environmental community. Commercial and recreational fisheries, including sea scallop, squid, surf clam, and fluke, contribute more than $7 billion to the regional economy each year. New York has worked hard to earn the trust of the fishing communities across the region through active engagement, including one-on-one interactions with them. We can and must reassure them that offshore wind development will not threaten their way of life and the communities they support. Although the commercial fishermen were initially reluctant to participate in discussions on offshore wind, they are now providing valuable local knowledge to be considered, and we thank them for that. New York's active effort is building on that cooperation by providing a forum for their voice on the Fishing Technical Work Group and by requiring fishery mitigation plans in the Nyserda RFP that President Barton discussed, something that no other state has done. Proper planning and siting of offshore wind in the New York Bight must include adequate consideration of its many diverse stakeholders and ecosystems. If done correctly, it will result in fewer conflicts, less environmental stress, greater project visibility, and ultimately, a more successful and sustainable development effort that will be essential in our fight against climate change. Thank you.
Finally, we'd like to hear from Ken Sheehan, who is currently Director of the Division of Clean Energy with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. Prior to returning to the state, Mr. Sheehan held positions in both the private and public world, including as Chief of Staff and Chief Counsel of the BPU, where he provided advice to members of the board, other cabinet levels, and the executive branch. Mr. Sheehan?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. I'd like to thank BOEM for everything that they've been doing on the New Jersey-New York Bight. I'm trying. I want it to stick. I know it hasn't worked yet, but I'm going to continue to try. I know it's the New York, New Jersey Bight. But thank you, everyone. I want to welcome all of the stakeholders here. It's always a delight and very important for us to receive this type of information. My colleagues from DEP are here, the Department of Environmental Protection, and obviously our colleagues from New York. Thank you for being here. On behalf of President Fiordaliso, my fellow commissioners at the BPU, including Commissioner Shivakula, who is here with us today, and Governor Murphy, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to BOEM, and thank you to the stakeholders. New Jersey has been strongly engaged in the process with BOEM of developing the call for information and commercial leasing area for the New York Bight. It's because New Jersey is an ocean state. I mean, we have 130 miles of coastline, and the shore helps define what New Jersey is. With that in mind, we have to make sure that we protect that environment while also ensuring that we use it for its best and highest use. When Governor Murphy came into office, one of the first executive orders he signed was Executive Order 8, which directed the Board of Public Utilities and the rest of the state to fully engage in the development of 1,100 megawatts of offshore wind immediately, and put us into a pipeline of 3,500 megawatts by 2030. The board has currently that 1,100 megawatt window open, and the 1,200 megawatt windows are expected to open in 2020 and 2022. This type of pipeline is largest in the country. The 1,100 megawatts is the largest individual solicitation in the country to date. And we are looking forward to using that to help satisfy Governor Murphy's mandate of 100% clean energy by 2050. In order to do that, however, we have to work cooperatively with all of the stakeholders. BOEM has been remarkably good with us in New Jersey in helping find time, place, and opportunity for us to continue these discussions. Most notably during the initial process when they gave us a little extra time to go ahead and conduct some conversations with the fishermen and other interested parties in the area. And that information absolutely worked its way into the final presentation here, and it would have been invaluable. So I want to really thank BOEM in New York for allowing that process to happen. With that in mind, we agree with New York that it is absolutely critical that there are additional lease areas in this energy region. We cannot do the entire combined energy without additional leases, and they need to happen quickly. Towards that, we want to make sure that we balance the needs of the fishing industry, the maritime industry, and everybody else who uses that area. And we want to make sure that we do it right and that we do it fast, because everyone is correct. This cannot wait. This is not kick the can down the road at this point. Towards that end, New Jersey today will be asking for a little bit of additional time to make sure that we have a full understanding of the Bight area and what's going on. And in no way will that slow the process down. In fact, we're looking to make sure that that provides the kind of information that can continue this process, and in fact, perhaps even speed it up. So towards that end, later today, my colleague Anne-Marie McShay will be giving a full presentation on where we are and what we're doing. But for the moment, I just wanted to really be able to bring to you the position of the state of New Jersey from the governor on down, which is that this is important. Thank you for being here. We want to hear, we want to help, and we want to move forward because we will have 3,500 megawatts in 2030, and we will be 100% clean energy by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those welcoming remarks. I actually thought they were fantastic, and I think they did a really good job of laying out sort of both the promise of what we're here to talk about today and the challenges and the need for balance, which just came up again and again, and balancing is an art form, and that's sort of the task that's before all of us today and really rests with BOEM. So what we've teed up today is a conversation that we think will help really animate what are these issues, what are these interests, what does BOEM need to balance as it goes forward and moves from a draft wind energy areas to final wind energy areas. So let me just give a quick highlight of the agenda and then some quick ground rules, and then we'll dive into things. So this morning, and this morning I mean till 12:40, so if you have some snacks, start using them. We're going to start with an overview of leasing activity in the New York Bight area. And as I mentioned, we'll hear about the draft wind energy areas and what they are and why they look the way they do. We'll then dive into these perspectives on the draft wind energy areas. This morning, we'll hear from the Department of Defense, from Coast Guard, from National Marine Fisheries Service, and from the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, which is also known as RODA. And for those of you that don't know that, that's a fishing industry group. We will also have an opportunity for public input between 12:10 and 12:40, and we'll really ask that to focus on folks who can't be here towards the end of the day. After lunch, we'll come back in the afternoon and we'll hear additional perspectives on the draft wind energy area, and that will really focus on hearing from the states first, so from New York and from New Jersey. And then we'll have small group discussions among task force where we'll ask you to chew on some questions like, what did you learn? What does it tell you about what these draft wind energy areas might look like? And what other information do you need? And we think that will be a really valuable and important part of this conversation. After an afternoon break, we'll hear from the developers that are here on what's going on with their projects and their efforts to develop offshore wind. And then finally, we'll talk about next steps and where this goes. Again, we'll have a second public input opportunity this afternoon, and that will start at 4:50 and go until 5:30. And we really are hoping and asking that all task force members will be able to stay until 5:30. We ask the public to sit for a very long time in the morning and then in the afternoon, and we really want to make sure that you all are able to hear their thoughts. And there's the agenda now. Meeting protocols, just a couple of things we ask of all of you as we go through the day today. One, participate actively. We really need to hear your thoughts, and you all need to hear each other's thoughts. That's the really key piece, so we need to hear from you. That said, lots to cover, lots of people in the room. Please be respectful of the amount of time that you're taking, so be focused in your comments, stay on point. The conversation is around the table. Again, this is a task force meeting, so that's where the conversation is, except for those two public input periods when we'll give folks who are in the back an opportunity to weigh in and share their thoughts. A couple of other points to note is when you want to get into the conversation, if you can take your name placards and just turn them on its side, that'll help me see who wants to get into the conversation, and I'll just sort of run a queue that way. If your cell phones are not already off or on silent, if you could pull them out and take them out and make sure they're silent, that would be great. And obviously, if you need to take a call, please head out of the room. BOEM is recording this meeting, so please just be aware of that. I don't know if there's any media here, but if there are, BOEM staff will be available to take any questions you might have at breaks or during lunch or afterwards. As I mentioned, Rebecca will be preparing a meeting summary based on this conversation. And I think that's all I want to say. And at this point, what I'd like to do is invite Jim Bennett, who is Chief of BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Program, and Luke Feinberg, who's Project Coordinator with BOEM. I suspect you know both of them quite well, to come up and talk about a little bit about what BOEM learned during the call for information and nominations, and then talk about their approach to draft wind energy area development.
Thank you, Bennett. Appreciate it. And I also want to thank everybody that is here, the task force members in particular, but also the members, stakeholders, insofar as your input, both from the task force members and the stakeholders, is critical to us coming to the right decisions as we move forward in New York Bight. Again, my name is Jim Bennett. I'm the program manager for offshore renewables. And I want to give you a little bit of the federal perspective, a little bit of context of what the program is and what we're doing and why. And we can start by noting our mandate, which is to pursue the expeditious and orderly development of the energy resources of the Outer Continental Shelf. The Outer Continental Shelf, as you're aware, for those of you who are not aware, is the area of federal jurisdiction extending from 3 miles offshore the states out to the limit of the EEZ, about 200 nautical miles. It's a lot of area. I do want to note that we have a number of folks here from BOEM. If everybody from BOEM could raise your hand, Throughout the course of the day, if you all have questions, please approach somebody from BOEM, and if they don't know the answer, we'll find out for you. That's part of the purpose of these meetings, to make sure that we have information exchanged in both directions. In addition to what you're probably familiar with as far as the Outer Continental Shelf is concerned, the oil and gas program, in 2005 we were given authority to move forward with alternative energy or renewable energy, essentially our wind program. And where we are with that right now, we have conducted 7 competitive lease sales, generated $68 million for the federal treasury, and leased almost 1.4 million acres. We have 12 active leases, approximately 17 gigawatts of capacity, extending from Massachusetts to North Carolina. Every state from Cape Cod to Cape Hatteras has at least one federal commercial lease off its shores. We have a diverse set of leaseholders, and I want to note that our program is active now on both coasts. We've had a call for information on a number of areas off of California, although that's further down the pipeline. But the potential in the Northeast is tremendous, as you're probably well aware. The leases we have up here, we've approved 7 site assessment plans, and we are reviewing 2 construction and operations plans up in the Massachusetts area, and we're looking forward to moving forward with the New York Bight. We anticipate several more construction and operations plans over the next couple of years. So my point there basically is that this is not occurring in a vacuum. This is a very substantial effort that includes calls, as you've heard earlier, from both New York for 2.4 gigawatts and from New Jersey for 3.5, and other states totaling about 10 gigawatts of solicitations for offshore wind energy. I want to mention just real quickly the process that we have gone through on these commercial leases, which includes a planning and analysis stage. We're still in the planning and analysis stage for the New York Bight, leading to a lease sale, hopefully within about a year or so. After a lease sale occurs and we have a lessee, site assessment phase that can extend for up to 5 years is what is pursued by the lessee in order to identify where the appropriate place, the exact configuration of a wind farm should be. And with that, the construction and operations phase, where after approval of the plan and a couple of years of construction time, a 25 or 30-year period of operations and generation of electricity. New York sparked this process a while ago with the identification of areas that they thought required or should be looked at in more detail. We picked up the ball from there, and we have been looking at these areas, had quite a number of meetings, quite a number of studies, and included the key states, of course, of New York and New Jersey, but also other states, including Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And with that, I want to note that we're at a stage where we're looking at wind energy areas. We've taken the very large areas and winnowed them down to the areas that we think we should be focusing on. Luke Feinberg, our project coordinator, is going to go into some of the details of how we got there, but it is a process in which we identify more appropriate areas and move forward with leasing in those areas to help fulfill the demands that the states and the public have made. So I'm going to hand it over to Luke. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. So my name is Luke Feinberg. I'm a project coordinator for BOEM, specifically working on the New York Bight here. And really, my job is to help you understand the process, where we've been, where we currently are, and where we're going to be going in the future. So this picture here is focusing on the planning and analysis stage. So that's the first stage, as you remember. And it starts with this call for information and nominations. And you hopefully you're all aware that was published this summer, or in the spring, and the comment period concluded this summer. And right now we're in this area identification phase, as indicated by our little note there. And just at a high level, so we start with a big call area, come down to a wind energy area, then what happens after that? Two concurrent processes. We have an environmental assessment process. So essentially, we identify an area of the Outer Continental Shelf, conduct an environmental assessment under NEPA, really ask the question is what are the impacts, and assess what are the impacts of site assessment activities, the installation of a buoy or a Met tower on that particular spot. And I want to make sure it's clear that process has a potential and likely will include several opportunities for formal public comment as well as informal public comment through stakeholder meetings. And as I said, concurrent with that process, we're also developing our leasing documentation. So the two big pieces to that are the proposed sale notice. And the key thing I think we need to make clear on that is that the proposed sale notice is what contains a proposed lease area. So it's not a wind energy area, it's a lease area. It's an area we're actually going to lease or proposing to lease at that stage. There's a public comment period associated with that, and that lease area becomes final when the final sale notice is released. And then shortly after a final sale notice, you'll see that the auction will take place. So, and to give you a little bit more information in terms of the timing here, what you can expect, early 2019, we'll see some wind energy areas. In the summer, a proposed sale notice will likely come out for the New York Bight, followed by a final sale notice in the late portion of 2019, and then, as Jim alluded to, in early 2020, we're hoping for a lease sale in this region. So to make sure we are clear on this, what is a wind energy area? This is really a key point of today's conversations, and technically, again, it's that portion of the Outer Continental Shelf that we're identifying and conducting that environmental assessment on, and it's kind of the basis for a lease area. So schematically, you start with a call area, a large area, which Jim showed a picture of earlier, and you get information on that call area from the public, federal agencies, state partners, et cetera, to help inform our process to identify a wind energy area. And that wind energy area is generally a smaller box within that, and this is traditionally the program has taken that wind energy area and then offered that for sale as a lease area, and it's been this very similar area. But we do have the flexibility within our regulations to divide that wind energy area into several different lease areas. And this is just illustrative. The number 4 here does not necessarily mean one thing or another, but it's really just trying to show the concept of winnowing down from call to wind energy area to a lease area. So focusing in on the call itself, as I said, the comment period for it closed on July 30th. I'd like to stop here and just thank everybody. You know, a lot of people in this room spent an awful lot of time putting those comments together. We got a tremendous turnout, 132 comments. A lot of them, you know, ranged from a couple sentences to over 70 pages of unique analysis on the Bight, and hopefully you'll see today that really did inform our process. So we really do appreciate the time you put into documenting and the studies that were done to produce those responses, as well as from the developers. You know, over eight nominations from qualified companies. It's not just drawing a square on a map, it's actually documenting why that particular area is attractive to them from a development standpoint. So this is where we turn the YouTube video on, and I go off and you get 20 minutes of YouTube recording. Hopefully a lot of you have seen the YouTube that Jim and I put together to basically explain how we got here, but hopefully you have seen that. I've added a few more interesting things in here to keep you engaged, so hopefully you'll enjoy some new information. But basically what we're trying to show here is how we got to these wind energy areas and make sure folks are on the same page. And what this slide here shows are the factors that were considered and sort of the most salient factors. This is not an exhaustive list. You could go on for pages in terms of the potential factors for consideration. These are the ones that we conducted specific analysis on and were most influential as part of our analysis. And so as a result of that, we ended up with these areas. And these are the draft wind energy areas that were released several weeks ago. And there's a couple things I want to point out. There's two colors here, right? There's the dark green, which we're calling primary areas, and the light green, which are our secondary areas. And essentially what that means is that the dark green areas, relative to all the areas in the call, are what BOEM sees as least conflicted with potential offshore wind energy generation. And we're not saying that there's no conflicts. In fact, I think I can confidently say that there's no space in the New York Bight that is not conflicted in some space. There's no free space in this area. But we do feel that based on the analysis we conducted and the input we received from you folks, that these are the areas that have the most promise for development. But we also recognize that there are other areas, these secondary areas, the light green areas, that also have a lot of promise for offshore wind development, but do have a few things to consider, and really we're trying to get more information from the task force about this, potential conflicts that would not necessarily make it as advantageous as the areas in dark green. So that's what we're trying to get comments on today. And to give you a sense of scale, we're talking about 316,000 acres for dark green, roughly about 4 gigawatts of energy, and then primary and secondary areas together, about 800,000 acres and close to 10 gigawatts of capacity. And again, that's if everything were to be developed. I should also mention that there's a third color on this map, this gray color, right? So if there are areas here that were not highlighted, what happens with that? It doesn't mean it's off the map. It means right now, given the information we have, we think there are other areas that have more potential for offshore wind, but it doesn't mean we can't go back. It doesn't mean 10 years from now we have new information we can't go back, and it doesn't mean that if we have a lot of people today saying that there are areas we should go back and look at that we took off the map, we'll consider that and we can have the ability to do that. All right, so now we're just gonna go call area by call area and describe a little bit more in finer detail about how we got to these areas. Framework, you'll see the area or the notations you see on the right side of the slide are really, again, the salient factors that were influential as part of our analysis process and as part of our delineation of call areas. And for this particular area, we're talking about nominations, visual historic properties, marine protected species, submarine cables, recreational commercial fishing. So what we were doing here is just basically showing the area in pink was an area that, based on our fisheries analysis and several other factors, was recommended to be removed and not coexist with offshore wind. And for those of you, hopefully you're familiar, we conducted a series of public meetings in September. There's a webinar on our website that goes into a little bit more detail about how we analyzed specifically the fisheries, but as well as navigation and other factors. It really boils down to a relative use index, and we have some posters in the back and some experts here with us today that can answer some more specific questions you have on that. But essentially, relative to the area within the call, based on revenue data and tracking data from fisheries, we've determined that the area in pink here, for example, has more fishing activity, so we've designated draft wind energy areas towards the west. The other key factor in fairways north is navigation, vessel navigation. So there's two pieces here. One is a tug and tow corridor, and that tug and tow corridor is indicated by the space between those two yellow lines. So there's a lot of existing traffic that kind of goes from Jersey up to New England, cuts across the Bight with tug and tow vessels. And we want to make sure that those vessels that current pathway is accommodated, and as part of, hear more today from the Coast Guard about their fairways designation process, but we recognize that there's a potential for a fairway to go in this region. We're not really sure where it will go. That's yet to be determined. And we're not really sure how wide it'll be. That's also yet to be determined. But based on the information we have today, we think that the fairway could go in this region, which is why the area underneath it is light green in this case. And the other hatching you'll notice here is this red hatching. And what that's meant to indicate is a 2 nautical mile buffer from the fairway that runs right here, connecting the traffic separation scheme down here. And so it's essentially a buffer from existing traffic. That was another factor that was recommended as part of the AC PARS process. Again, we'll talk more about that later today. So the new information, we wanted to give you a sense of the size of these areas and what that means for offshore wind development. So the area here, we're talking about the dark green area being about 13,000 acres and has an energy potential of about 160 megawatts. Energy potential is a little bit, there's several assumptions that come with that, and We're using a very conservative measure here, so it's 0.01 megawatts per acre. We do acknowledge that there are concentrations of offshore wind, especially in Europe, that are 4 times greater than that. So it's kind of, just keep that in mind when you look at these numbers. There is a potential for greater density once we have more information about a site. And then the light green area itself is about 26,000 acres, 315 megawatts. So if you were to put those both together, you just add those numbers together to get, if you were to develop that entire area as a wind energy area. All right, so fairways south, very similar factors being considered here. Again, we have fisheries being a concern, as well as cables and navigation in that eastern portion of fairways south. We did have a higher concentration of nominations in the western portion of fairway south. That's why a portion of it is dark green in the middle there. But you notice we're dealing with similar factors regarding the fairway, proposed fairway or transit corridor, as well as the 2 nautical mile buffer. These areas also, they're not tremendously huge, but I think what the key thing to capture here is that, again, density ratio is a little bit subjective, and that may change, but also just because this area is concurrent, right, it doesn't mean that it has to be a lease area, right? A lease area could include annexes, if you will, right? So you could have a lease area. This could be part of a lease area, this could be part of a lease area, this could be part of a lease area. It could all be one, it could all be separate. So even if you think they're really small, that's true, they are small, but they could be combined with a larger piece. And it's not saying that's definitely the direction we're going to go, it's just a tool on the table we have to potentially use. Moving to Hudson South, 2 areas were identified here, the southern portion of Hudson South and then the northwestern portion. This area is heavily used. It's a rather large area, and some of the key considerations, again, several nominations were received here. We do acknowledge there's a lot of recreational commercial fishing here, especially from the commercial fishing side, which is a large driver for why the areas that were removed were, as well as vessel navigation. Of note here, the area in the northwest not only was an area of relatively less use of fisheries, but also was an area in which some of the members of the fishing industry said, well, this is actually an area we think you should develop for offshore wind from a fishing perspective, from that one industry's perspective. So that was one of the reasons why that is in dark green, highlighted up here. And we also have the area to the south. The dark green area overlaps, again, more areas from fisheries recommendation, but also positive impact from our navigation analysis. So quickly here, just want to introduce a new factor, which is this idea of spreading. Essentially, we have vessels that traditionally are exiting the traffic separation scheme, and if you're heading to Africa, you want to take a shortcut, so you kind of spread outside of the traditional lane if you were to sort of extend this traffic separation scheme. So we do acknowledge that this wind energy area here is one that does potentially interfere with spreading, but also leaves the door open for continued vessel navigation in this region. So these areas are a little bit larger when you combine the light green and dark green, especially the area to the south. I will note that the area to the south here is important because it's one of the few areas that does not have sort of an outstanding caveat with it, right? So we're talking about the navigation corridor potentially going in here, and you'll hear a little bit further from our partners at DoD about some considerations in Hudson South. Moving along here for Hudson South, again, similar considerations. The area you see in dark green, again, was an area with relative less fisheries use, relative less navigation use. Why that was in dark green, where the areas here in light green are indicated as such based on, again, spreading and also relative use of fisheries. And we also have a little bit higher concentrations of fisheries in this area here. So as I said, these are larger areas with the potential to have multiple lease areas within them. These are typically we're sort of looking at an area of about 80,000 acres. That's what was leased for the current Empire Wind site. So that can give you a sense of what this looks like. Okay, so I kind of covered this, but road ahead, I just want to be clear of where we're going here, right? So early 2019, early next year, you'll see some final areas largely informed from this discussion here. That's followed by a proposed sale notice, which will be in the summer of 19, followed by a late sale notice, or a final sale notice in late 2019, and then a lease sale in 2020. So I think we may have time for a couple quick questions, perhaps, from the task force, if there's any clarifying questions on the process.
Yeah, just a question or two, and again, really focused on clarifying questions at this point. Yeah, please.
When do you expect that site assessment EA to be out? Or are you using a programmatic from the board?
So the EA will be conducted, well, a notice of intent will go out when the the final wind energy areas go out. We do have departmental guidance to conduct that EA within 6 months. So we also are considering releasing that EA for public comment as well. So you can kind of think about that in a 6-month window after the NOI goes out.
And just if you haven't seen it already on the tables, there are a couple of packets with some of the maps that Luke just shared. So if you need to refer to those during the day, please just look towards the center of your table.
Yeah, actually, to add to that, so there's the maps of the wind energy areas themselves, but also some reference slides, some things I actually didn't show, which will come in later, some of the building blocks that made the draft wind energy areas, so you can reference that.
Any other clarifying questions for Luke before he escapes? Yeah, please.
Megawatts per acre, how is that calculated?
So it's 0.01 megawatts per acre is the factor there, but again, that can really range depending on. It's a conservative measure because we don't really have detailed geotech, geophysical conditions or understand that right now. So we're also not trying to assume a certain density or the risk a developer is willing to take.
Great, thanks, Luke. That was a really good overview. And again, as Luke mentioned, if folks didn't have a chance to look at the presentation that's online, it's sort of a slower, deeper take at what Luke just ran through. So certainly take advantage of that if that is helpful. So at this point, as I mentioned, we really want to spend the bulk of the day getting feedback and perspectives on these draft wind energy areas, and we want to start that conversation now. This morning, we'll hear from a number of BOEM's federal partners, and first up, we'll hear from the Department of Defense. We'll hear from Fred Engel, and Fred is Director of Military Training and Ranges with the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, and he'll have about 15 minutes of presentations or so, and then again an opportunity for some questions. So I will just get his presentation up here, and then we'll get going. Showing up like that, Fred. It's a PDF.
Do you have the phaser? Is that up here somewhere? Voila. Okay, great. Thanks very much. Good morning. As Bennett said, thank you, Bennett. As Bennett said, I'm Fred Engel. I'm the Director for Military Training and Ranges at the Department of Defense. So I work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Secretary Mattis. Few echelons down below Secretary Mattis, but I report to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for readiness. So what we're all about right now in the Department of Defense is ready. Speak up. Okay. How's this? Better? We're good? Okay. So first off, I want to thank the state of New York for hosting us here and for ordering up this great pre-winter weather. And I think it was a little windy out there too, which I guess is apropos for what we're here to talk about today. And I also want to thank our colleagues at BOEM for inviting us to present at the task force meeting. We haven't presented at a task force meeting since April 2012 out in Plainview, Long Island. So it's good to be back and talking to the New York and now the New Jersey task force as well. We did a separate presentation to you all in Trenton, I think, about the same time period. So in the Department of Defense, we have a lot of equities offshore. And we work a lot with Dr. Crookshank and his staff on the full spectrum of energy resources offshore. And so wind obviously is an important resource to be developed. And Department of Defense, we fully understand that energy security and national security are inextricably linked. We get that. we spend a lot of time worrying about energy just for our own current operations. So we fully support the development then of our nation's domestic energy resources to include offshore, but in a way that's compatible with the military readiness activities that we conduct offshore, onshore, wherever. So in my title, Ranges, that includes offshore, includes airspace, it includes land space onshore. So we spend a lot of time with other federal agencies. Other agencies from the Department of Interior would be Bureau of Land Management, for example. So we have a lot of equities. And the fact that we spend that much time with the Department of Interior and with, in this case with BOEM, it just highlights how important the offshore waters of our nation are for the military activities that we do. So we have basically three major equities offshore. We have training, so I'm the training guy for the Department of Defense. We have testing, and we have operations. I'll talk a little bit about operations when we get to the map. Testing, we do developmental testing and operational testing. There's significant difference between those two types of testing, but those are done offshore as well. Not so much up here in the New York Bight. More importantly, more significantly off places like Port Mugu, California, and off of Eglin Air Force Base in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. So on the training standpoint, then, we conduct more training out there offshore than we do the other two equities that I mentioned. In DoD, we say we train the way we fight, and we add on to that, we don't fight in simulators. So our job is to train young men and women to go in harm's way to do the mission that they're required to do. And ultimately, we have to do that in a live training environment, which means we need airspace, sea space, land space in order to do that. So, so when BOEM asked us, this is back in 2009, 2010, to do our first wind assessment, it was off the state of Virginia, and we struggled with that. We had done assessments before for offshore oil and gas. We understood what an oil platform looked like and what the infrastructure associated with oil and gas offshore looked like. We didn't understand wind. So we were told at the time, well, look at the North Sea. That's probably the best example to see what an offshore wind farm off of our coast would look like. So we did that. And we then developed our methodology based on that. And I forget what actual height we were looking at, but it was not what it is today. And so as the process went on, and particularly when we started looking at floating wind structures off of states like Hawaii and California, we said, well, these don't exist anywhere. How does this scale up? What's a floating wind farm look like? How big are these things? So in the end, we asked BOEM to go to the Department of Energy and come back and tell us what is the biggest thing we're likely to see in, say, the next 10 years. So they came back with a 10 megawatt turbine, probably with a rotor tip height, maximum height of 805 feet. And so that was the assumption we used as we do these assessments. And so when you see the red on these charts, that's based on a turbine that has a maximum height of 805 feet and a 10 megawatt turbine. The turbine size isn't that important. It's really the height and the diameter of the rotor that's important to us, and I'll talk more about that, why that's important. We developed then 3 categories as we went through this process. And so unrestricted obviously would imply that we have no concerns with a wind development in that area. That we colored green on our charts. I'll talk a little more about that when we get to the charts. Site-specific stipulations. So these are the yellow areas on our chart. So these are areas where, given certain mitigations, we can probably can be able to conduct our missions there at the same time as wind energy production and construction production are going on there. So the important thing to remember here, though, is that Department of Defense is not the decision maker in this process. Okay, we do these assessments for BOEM. BOEM is the authority here. They own the lease process, not DoD. We are just a stakeholder like the rest of you all. Now, that said, we have a lot of activity out there, so we're a pretty big stakeholder, but we do not have the authority to tell BOEM what to do here. So we provide these robust assessments to BOEM, and then BOEM will make an informed decision based on that. So that leads me then to the red area, which is what everybody's concerned about, the wind exclusion areas. So these are areas where, at the most fundamental level, where the activity of wind development, or whether it's or even an oil and gas platform, just is clearly not going to work for DoD, because probably the best example then is live fire. We're shooting stuff in the water. We do things that are inherently dangerous, and we have to do it to train those young men and women so that when they go in harm's way, they will have done live fire over the water or wherever they're going. So clearly, those two activities are going to be incompatible. But with mitigations, we might be able to work out something. So that's the yellow areas. So you'll see a lot of red on these charts. Look at the yellow areas too. And so with the stipulations for those yellow areas, we have 4 stock stipulations that we talk about, but there could be other stipulations. So the first stipulation is hold harmless. So like I said, we do things that are inherently dangerous offshore. So we would ask then that a project that goes in there, that DoD would be held harmless if we have some kind of misadventure, like a missile goes stupid during the test and knocks down a wind turbine. So again, we've been doing these activities out here for decades, so you assume some risk if you put a project there. Second stipulation, sort of stock stipulation, would be notification. Obviously, wind turbines, offshore wind structure, these are big things, and when you're moving these things on a barge or whatever, if you would coordinate that with the Department of Defense, we wouldn't want that vessel going through an area where we're conducting a major anti-submarine warfare exercise, for example. So let's deconflict the schedules. Another stipulation would be potential restrictions on use of parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're very sensitive, particularly in test activities, to electromagnetic emissions, and so we might ask during certain periods of time certain radars or communications not be used while we're conducting that test activity. And then the final stipulation would be, because we do things that are inherently dangerous, we would ask that you, with ample notification, you would evacuate people from that area so that no one would hurt, again, if we have a misadventure, missile goes stupid or something like that. So those are our stipulations. When we do the assessments, we take it down to the lease block level, and where necessary, we'll go down to the aliquot level. I'm sure everyone's familiar with what an aliquot is. So we try to get as fine-grained an assessment as possible. We only assess what BOEM asks us to assess. So we haven't assessed the entire exclusive economic zone for offshore wind. We're going to go with certain areas. And I'll talk a little bit about more on that when we get to the map. So in 2012, last time we briefed you all, the area that we looked at back then. All right. So it was much closer into Long Island and down off New Jersey like this. Subsequent to that, New York said, we want you to look at a wider area. So then we went further out. All right. Okay. Don't want to put somebody's eye out with this laser. So we went down then to this much larger area. And at the time, a lot of this area was still yellow, site-specific stipulations. In early 2017, because these assessments have a shelf life, and so it was time to refresh the assessments, and Dr. Crookshank wrote to us and asked us to update our offshore assessments for the Atlantic. And in doing so, we found out then that there was a training activity going on here in this warning area, W107A, which we refer to as Whiskey 107 Alpha because we have to put it in DoD speak. So this warning area is an important training area for the Marine Corps. And I have colleagues from Headquarters Marine Corps here, Major Floss and Mr. Simon, who can answer specific questions about the training activities that go on out there. Yeah. I'll put this thing down. So the other thing, the red areas up in the northeast corner there, and that kind of circular thing there, are other training activities. I'm a former submariner. I used to operate out of Groton. I can just tell you that there are training activities that we do there, and we'll just leave it at that. Closer in, you'll see there's some linear features. Those are that go over the land and out onto the water. Those are military training routes, so aircraft that are flying out offshore will be using those routes to access the warning area, Whiskey 107, Alpha Bravo, and Charlie, to do the training that's out there. And you can see the onshore installations there, Joint Base McGuire, Dix, Lakehurst. The aircraft that are using this warning area are based out of, some of them are based out of there. And again, if there's other questions about that, so we'll call on the Marine Corps to answer those. So where we are now, and again, remember, I can't hammer this home too much, the assumption is it's an 805-foot structure. Okay, we had to start somewhere. So if you're thinking about a 650-foot structure, this red, that's something where y'all need to talk to, in this case, it would be to the Marine Corps for these warning areas. So BOEM has asked us to look at the proposed wind energy area. So this is in Hudson South, the light green and dark green areas. You can see here that bold, dark line there in Hudson South. BOEM has asked us to take a hard look at that area. And so where that stands right now, it's with the mission commanders at the Marine Corps at the unit level, and they're taking a look at that. And we will probably hear back from them in January, February. Yeah. So nothing happens quickly in the Department of Defense when it comes to this sort of thing, because you have to go through so many echelons of approval before we can actually sign it out and release it to BOEM. So it takes a fair amount of time. So at that point, this subject to your questions, this concludes my briefing. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Fred. So just to be clear, so as folks look at this map now, it may or may not change based on what you get back.
That's exactly right. So again, if the turbines are not that tall, then we can probably talk. What I didn't mention, so if you'll indulge me just for 1 minute, and you all know this, particularly folks in the industry, so a rotating wind turbine degrades the performance of primary radars, all right? So why this matters to us so much, and from an operational standpoint, and this is the operational mission I was going to mention from Northern Command, NORAD, Northcom, who is the combatant commander for North America, a command that was stood up in the wake of 9/11. What happened on 9/11? The first thing the bad guys did when they got in the cockpits of those aircraft, they turned off the transponders. So the signal that would come out from the aircraft saying, "I'm United 105," that signal didn't exist anymore. So only the older primary radar, which is basically a skin paint, the radar signal goes out, it hits the aircraft, and returns a signal that is a blip on a screen. That was the only thing that was left available to track those aircraft on 9/11. That mission, which was going away, the FAA was getting out of that business, that mission now came back with a vengeance and is very important to us. Unfortunately, a rotating wind turbine rotor degrades the performance of those primary radars. And so that's problematic for us, because we have radar sites along our coast and our borders that are looking outward for what are called uncooperative aircraft that aren't squawking, that aren't operating that transponder. They're flying into our airspace that are a potential threat, and that's when, of course, we scramble the F-16s, and they go up and see who these guys are. I had left that out, so thank you for indulging me.
Thanks, Fred. So questions for Fred and Department of Defense, their take on these wind energy areas and their considerations. Any task force members? Yeah, please. Here, let me
Question for BOEM. Given the timeline, are you waiting to complete the identification of wind energy areas till after this assessment?
I think the assessment is going to be going on a continuous basis, and what we've identified is absence the full clarity on how the area in Hudson South interacts with the Defense Department, that we would be leaving that in and focusing on it and moving forward. It may end up being removed. It may be something that we'll be able to work out with the Department of Defense.
Other questions? Yeah. Hang on a second, Greg.
So it's actually a three-part question. So the first one being, so this seems like a depiction of existing activities in the space. And so you were reflecting what is done historically there. Are there options for relocating those activities to other areas that provide less conflict? And also, if you could give a little more description of what those activities are, I think we'd all be interested in that. And then finally, you started with, it's BOEM's decision. And I'm wondering how, when the military paints a red area, saying it's an exclusion zone, and then says BOEM gets to decide, how does that work?
Those are all good questions. So let me start with your last question first, and then on your second question on the detail of the activities, I'm going to turn it over to Marine Corps to explain that. And then on your first question about relocating activities somewhere else. Sure, it's always possible. We have what's called the BRAC process, where we have over the years closed bases, realigned activities, and all that. Those things are possibilities. There are costs associated with that. There are reasons these units are located where they are, and they have to train where they are. This is their backyard range, so this is where they're training all the time. And these skills, these warfighting skills, are perishable skills. If you don't stay, trained up and ready to deploy, and there are different cycles for people when they're ready to deploy or not, but you've got to be ready to deploy, and you've got to keep those skills fresh. And going out and doing it live is ultimately the way to do that. So yes, you can move these things, but again, there's cost associated with that. It's not that simple. And these are the questions that we ask in my office at the DoD level when the military services come to us and say, well, we do this activity there. First question we ask is, well, could you move it? Yeah, but if we move that, and the Marine Corps will talk about some of the complexities of the training activities here with regard to the units. So they'll handle the second question. Your third question then on why DoD, BOEM is the decision maker. With DoD though, what's our relationship? So there's a 1983 memorandum of agreement that was signed by James Watt and Caspar Weinberger that basically commits both Departments of Interior and Defense to work together, each department acknowledging the other department's missions, and that we will work together and we will find solutions. And that's really why we're here. We're not here, and like I said in the beginning, we're not here to say no to offshore energy development. By God, enough Americans have gone in harm's way over, to protect resources. So the example, we spent a lot of time during Operation Iraqi Freedom protecting fuel convoys. Energy is so important to the Department of Defense, because almost every platform we operate requires energy. So we get it. Believe me, we are not trying to stop offshore wind development. And these are not matters of convenience. We're not saying don't do this because it will be inconvenient for us to go somewhere else. It's more than that. There's a darn good reason for us doing this where we are. Like I said, we spend a lot of time working with BOEM. We have a very good working relationship with them. We're engaged almost every week and several times a week with staff over there at BOEM. So we'll find a solution here that will work for the states and will work for BOEM and work for the Department of Defense. I mean, we have to do that. That's our job. That's why we're here. So then on your second question, so have I answered for number one, number three? Okay, good, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Major Floss from Headquarters Marine Corps. He will take you through the technical details of what's exactly going on here. Major?
Hi, good morning. My name is Jim Flass. I work for Headquarters Marine Corps, and I'm representing us for the equities here on behalf of the Commandant. My history is I'm a naval aviator, so I've flown off the coast of North Carolina in a jet since 2004, as recently as about 2 years ago, so I'm familiar with those aspects. Have not flown here. We did this evaluation based on the units that are in New Jersey and in New York. There's a C-130 unit out of Jimmy Stewart Air Force Base, and then, as you see on the screen, a CH-53 comes out of New Jersey, and they do their training in those spaces. The biggest conflict in the equities we have here was in aerial refueling, and I think it's in the next slide for sling load. So pilots and aircrew are basically risk mitigators. So what we're doing in all of our decision making is trying to do our operations training in the least risky manner that we have. But we have to train in the same parameters that we would be expected to fight in. So in the activities in that area, one of them is aerial refueling. The C-130s being the ones that are carrying the fuel, the CH-53s being the one receiving. And then, as Fred mentioned, this is the parameters that we placed for the way we consider it. The lowest altitude that they the feedback that we got that they were fuel at is 1,000 feet. So from that, we want a 500-foot bubble, the same as the FAA gives as a minimum required for safety, so you don't want to get too close to objects. And then on that, when you join on to the tanker, you join from below. So you can see here the altitude that the aircraft could be receiving at is about 700, 800 feet, which is at that tip height, and that's before the potential for a sling load that would be under the aircraft, and that goes towards the height. Picture of some of the operations. You can see it's been over the water. And that goes towards what Fred talked about, is the altitude is what's key and why we're re-investigating this. We're not sure of the specifics of that squadron, and they're going to answer if that would actually affect their training, and then therefore the colors on the chart. The other equities that we had, and I don't believe, and Simon, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, we were looking at air-to-surface gunnery in some of those ranges. I don't believe it affects the Hudson South, and that was a different area that wasn't really looked at. Is that correct?
There's some live fire that takes place there, but very minimal gunnery, surface gunnery with the Navy.
Yeah, so it's mostly on the Navy side, surface gunnery, and that would have to be answered separately. That'd be part of the assessment. Does that answer the questions that specifically had, or other questions for our activities out there?
Greg, did that get the answer? Yeah, I did. Okay, good.
Thank you.
We have time maybe for one or two more quicker questions if we have. Anybody?
Thank you. My question really relates to the existing lease areas that obviously I assume went through a similar process. How has your thinking changed, or is it basically the same process that you went through years ago?
Yeah, no, good question. The existing commercial lease areas, we assessed at site-specific stipulations. We are, though there have been new maps that were released by the Department of the Navy that showed those areas as red, because the Navy does have concerns there, but the Department of the Navy said that they do not object, not to the point that we can object, because we're not the decision maker, do not object to commercial development going forward in those areas that were originally done. I think these are the ones Secretary Salazar outlined, the wind energy areas off the East Coast. So those commercial areas are fine. As, again, stipulations, of course. We'll want to know more details. We'll want to see the construction operation plans, those sorts of things. And that's the thing too, is we're working at the planning level. Okay, it really comes down to we need to see that site assessment plan, and more importantly, we need to see that COP and just what's going to go in there. And that's when I'll ship it off then to NORAD out in Colorado Springs, working for Northern Command, Combatant Commander. And they'll take a hard look and see, well, okay, we may need another stipulation like, it's in radar line of sight. Could we lower the height from 700 feet to 650 feet, something like that, to get it out of radar line of sight, those sorts of things. We don't have those details, obviously, until we have a COP. But those commercial lease sites are good to go from a DoD perspective with stipulations.
Great. Fred, thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation. I think it's a lot of helpful information for everyone here. Thank you. So at this point, we want to get you into a break, and then we'll come back and hear from other federal partners here. So please be back in 15 minutes. We'll start at 20 to 11 sharp. Thank you.